Was Winston Churchill really a progressive? Sinclair McKay says so in this week's magazine. He says that history trying to cast him as a sexist or imperialist is wide off the mark. He joins me to make his case. Sinclair, it's the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth, and we live in a world where many academics and journalists say that he was racist, imperialist, sexist. Your argument in this week's magazine is that he was a progressive pioneer. Tell us why.
He was a progressive pioneer because in certain flashes of his long life, he lived for 90 years. So he was born in 1874 and lived right the way through to 1965, the apotheosis of the Rolling Stones. A great deal has changed throughout that time, and a great deal changed with Churchill too. Yes, there are many academics who are interested in appropriating him as a model of the racist, imperialist, genocidal warmonger. But actually, there's all sorts of different other sides to Churchill that you see peeking through, like flashes from a diamond all the way through his life.
You mentioned Churchill's views on gender and sexuality. Apparently he said that in a next life he'd like to come back as a woman.
And yes, he was talking to his cousin Claire Sheridan in 1920. This was just 2 years after the end of the First World War. He was very drunk. He was with several friends of his and Claire Sheridan in a sort of artistic retreat in Teddington. And she came back one night to discover Churchill in a very sort of non-binary silk dressing gown with several of his friends, absolutely pie-eyed on champagne. And he said, in the next life I intend to come back as a woman.
You also mentioned in your article that he had a relationship with Jenny Lee, the Labour MP and founder of the Open University, who he got on well with. What do you take or what do you read from that relationship?
Well, there are two different things, actually. One of the interesting things about Churchill's life is he lived at a time when men generally didn't think that women should be in politics to begin with. And in fact, it took him a long time to come around to do the suffragette movement and votes for women. But also on top of that, it was a time when men of his class particularly found it quite difficult to talk to women, to look women directly in the eye, to treat them as equals. Churchill actually had a number of very strong friendships with a number of actually rather brilliant women. Violet Asquith, Jenny Lee being another, because another aspect of his life was that even though he loathed socialism in his bones, detested communism, he got on terrifically well with his political opponents. Jenny Lee was one of them. She was a firebrand Labour MP who got elected to the House in 1929. She was very young. She was in her 20s. So an extraordinary kind of radical figure to land in the House of Commons, all the way up to Scotland. You would have thought just the mortal enemy of Churchill. So Churchill just made a beeline for her. And she was rather kind of beguiled by the fact that he was willing to engage with her and have kind of the proper kind of debates. And so he would have been regarded by her as a kind of monster. But as their friendship went on through to the 1950s, when she was married to to the man who invented Nye Bevan, the man who invented the health service. Even by the 1950s, she was rather charmed and beguiled by Churchill.
You also mentioned in your piece that he may have been slightly more open-minded on homosexuality than his peers would have been at the time.
Absolutely. I think in that sense, Churchill was a curious, genuine kind of pioneer. One of his best friends, Eddie Marsh, who was a brilliant, not only just a civil servant, but a fantastic kind of art collector, artistic figure. Eddie Marsh was not exactly openly gay, but at the same time didn't exactly disguise it either. And he was one of Churchill's best friends, closest associates for many, many years. Eddie Marsh introduced him to the gay composer Ivor Novello, with whom Churchill also got on terrifically well. He was very great friends with W. Somerset Maugham, the gay novelist. And again, this was at a time when homosexuality was legal, so none of these figures would have proclaimed kind of out loud their orientation. But at the same time, it would have been fairly apparent to Churchill, who had seen a bit of the world and understood a bit of the world, and it made no difference to him. Others may have shied away from such friendships for fear of scandal, for instance, but Churchill never did.
You do accept in your piece that Churchill had, quote, grim views on race. What was his outlook?
I always slightly wonder about. Yes, he was racist, and people at the time thought he was racist too. It's not controversial to say that, but there are different levels to this. He was quoted as being incredibly rude about the Indian people, for instance. And his own friend, Leo Amory, who went to school with him at Harrow, was horrified by Churchill's views on India. But at the same time, again, there are layers here. We think of Churchill as a child of empire. He was brought up in its kind of the golden sunsets of empire. He lived its kind of fullest life. So that to him was the way the world worked. It would have been very unusual had it been otherwise. But at the same time, there are other instances in that. I was thinking of the 1919 Amritsar massacre, when General Dyer opened fire on an unarmed crowd. And it was expected of Churchill in 1919 that he would stand up in Parliament and defend General Dyer and his actions, and he didn't. He said that this was frightfulness. This is exactly the kind of thing that empire shouldn't be doing. Empire should not be founded on force, because if it's founded on force, then the entire point of it kind of fails. So in many instances, you find that actually he's the opposite of a genocidal warmonger. He's much more human than that. There is a real living human underneath the layers of caricature of Churchill.
Of course, compared to today's standards, being friends with people or not being as explicitly racist as one might expect in a moment is a very, very low bar.
Yes.
I suppose my question to you is, many people will not accept that Churchill was pioneering progressivism, but they will still recognize him as an important historical figure. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's right?
Yes, but what you also see with Churchill is many of those who now seek to write entire books about how he was a genocidal warmonger, imperialist, and all the rest of it, are in a sense trying to get control of history, which is what Churchill himself was trying to do, having written so much himself over the years. His own 5-volume account of the Second World War, for instance, but beyond that, he was always very, very piercingly aware of his own part as a landmark of kind of history, even at the time. But it's also important to say it's now said that there's a kind of cult of Churchill, that there is kind of unreasoning kind of worship of Churchill, and actually that was never the case. At any kind of point through his life, there were always those who could bitterly, absolutely opposed him and hated him. He was hated by so many Welsh people, and still is, for his actions at Tonypandy in 1910, the general strike of 1926. The entire Labour movement abominated Churchill. He was seen as a monster to so many of them. But on the other side of that, when many of his opponents came finally into close contact with them, they did see that there were kind of layers of kind of humour and layers of compassion too. There was the story of the Liverpool MP Bessie Braddock, who was a formidable, brilliant left-wing figure in the 1950s. She was implacably opposed to Churchill. There was the famous story where she rounded on Churchill and said, "Winston, you're drunk." And he said, "Madam, you're ugly, but tomorrow I shall be sober." Very ungallant. I'm not entirely sure if actually it's true. She didn't even mention it in her memoirs. But what she did say in her memoirs was that they had various other encounters in the House of Commons, and she couldn't help thinking that actually, all right, yes, he is the greatest living Englishman. He was a monster for 1926 and the general strike, but there are other sides of him.
What sort of conservative would Churchill be today? Where would he fall in the party?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Especially when it comes to social issues or small L liberal values.
Yes, I mean, would he be... It's very difficult to say. Would he now fall more on the Rory Stewart side rather than the Reform Richard Tye side? I think he would be. He wouldn't be a supporter of Nigel Farage. I don't think that kind of simplistic populism, that bombastic populism, would not be his style at all. And as I say, there are layers of subtlety in Churchill's politics. He was always open to new. He was in many. He reformed prisons, for instance, which is why I mentioned the Rory Stewart possible tie-up. He was also he introduced a certain sort of trade union reforms early in the sort of the 20th century, which meant that unions could not be sued by employers automatically. So every time we think of Churchill as being an extreme right-winger, you always find a case of him actually not being an extreme right-winger at all. Him understanding that sometimes the economy has to be fixed so that working people who find themselves in distress through no fault of their own have to be helped. In that sense, yes, I would say the more moderate.
Potentially on the left of the party. Very interesting. Sinclair?
Or the party as it stands at the moment, anyway.
Thanks so much for joining me.